all set.
All right. Well, ladies and gentlemen, very good morning to you all. My name is Brian Finlay. I'm the president and CEO here at the Stimson Center. It's grateful to have you all join us. I particularly want to thank Trends Research and Advisory. This is an organization based in Abu Dhabi, a think tank in Abu Dhabi, an independent think tank in Abu Dhabi that Stimson has had a long and very fruitful collaboration with over many years, ranging on issues ranging from counterterrorism to global energy and specifically the strategic implications of energy poverty around the globe. That is an issue that is near and dear to Stimson's heart and to our research agenda here at the Stimson Center, and really is the focus of much of my colleague Brian Eiler's work. Brian, whom you will be hearing more from shortly, directs our energy and sustainability work as well as our Southeast Asia programming. And Brian, through his work, particularly on the ground in the region in Southeast Asia, is dedicated, as is the rest of the institution, not just to identifying and quantifying problems, but to rolling up his sleeves and rolling up our collective sleeves to identify solutions. And I think the work that is being released here today is a first step, and you're going to hear certainly more about this report from this esteemed panel shortly. With us is Richard Burchill from Trends, flying across from Abu Dhabi just to be with you all here today. Richard, thank you so much for being here. I'm also very pleased to be joined here by Ambassador Lincoln Bloomfield. Ambassador Bloomfield is the Chairman Emeritus of the Stimson Center and is a recognizable face, not just on these issues, but as a long pedigree working these issues and other defense and strategic issues, both at the Department of State as well as at the Pentagon. Mr. Chairman Emeritus, thank you for joining us here as well. It will be no surprise to anyone who is following this issue closely that the UAE has really emerged as a global leader on innovation, particularly in the renewable energy space. It was an early supporter of the Paris Climate Agreement, an early supporter of the UN Sustainable Development Goals, particularly as they're related to energy and energy poverty issues, and it has made as well some very significant strategic investments of its own, not just in Masdar locally, in ARENA, both of which you will be hearing more from as well, but also through the Abu Dhabi Fund for Development, specifically targeted at this issue. For us here at Stimson, this report is an early step toward, as I mentioned, not just quantifying a problem, but in trying to identify tangible solutions to that problem, and that problem being energy poverty, growing energy poverty around the globe. And we are committed, and my colleague Brian Eiler in particular is committed to identifying solutions that are South-South in nature, that can leverage innovation that has occurred in one part of the world to the benefit of another, and seeing certainly the strategic investments that the UAE has made in this issue is, for us at least, one indication that UAE has much more to offer, we believe, in terms of addressing the strategic implications of energy poverty, the development implications of energy poverty, innovation, and so much more. And so with that, I will once again thank you and congratulate you on a great first step in building this new effort, Brian, and turn it over to you.
Thanks, Brian. Thank you for those opening comments. It's a real pleasure to be here and launch our report, UAE Energy Diplomacy, exporting renewable energy to the global south. This is a collaborative effort formed between a partnership with the Stimson Center and the Trends Institution in Abu Dhabi, working with Mr. Richard Burchill, Dr. Richard Burchill, and my colleague Courtney Weatherby, who is the lead author on this report, who unfortunately is recovering quickly from an illness that has kept her away from this publication launch. And she's really been the brains behind this report. So I hope I can do her work justice. We work mostly in Southeast Asia, our team, through our Southeast Asia program, and recently embarked on a widening of the scope of our programmatic work to take some of the lessons learned in Southeast Asia, a toolbox, if you will, of policy approaches and technical approaches to see if there are other landscapes across the globe that these methods can be applied. In the process of working in Southeast Asia, where we hit at the heart of this renewable energy transition that's really beginning to crash in countries, crash in a positive way, on the shores of Thailand and Vietnam, to some extent Cambodia, Laos, and Myanmar, to promote the renewable energy transition, particularly promote the non-hydropower renewable energy transition, because the too much hydropower, our research shows, for mainland Southeast Asia will really hurt the ecology, as well as those resources that are derived from the ecology of the Mekong River itself, which flows through those countries. And in this process, we were telling the story of how globally the renewable energy transition is playing out throughout the world. And time after time at our presentations, we were hitting on the UAE, on the UAE's record solar competitions for prices of solar less than 3 cents per kilowatt hour, and then watching this record play out over time. And as we were doing these workshops and meetings, more and more people came to us and said, what's going on in the UAE? And we didn't have a good answer to that question. So to answer that question, we talked with Brian Finley, who put us in touch with Trends, and took a trip to the UAE, which began last year. And the culmination of that work is this report. And not only in this report are we telling the story of what the UAE has done to rise as a global leader in the renewable energy transition, but we take another angle of how the UAE can expand its engagement globally to export the best practices and the policy practices and the investment practices that come out of that story to the global south. And as Brian said earlier, we believe that typically the flows of investment and capacity building for this renewable energy transition or energy sector development, regardless, flows from the north to the south. But look here, there is a country in the MENA region that is plowing energy and resources into becoming the best in the world for solar power development. And that's just not manifesting in capacity, overall capacity, and a high energy target, but it's the policy process that has taken the UAE there, the investment landscape that has been developed, and the smart hand, the wise hand of the government in bringing this to bear. So my presentation is going to be a brief introduction to that story, and then what the UAE can do to widen its engagement with the global south. Very quickly, you can see here on this chart that in 2017, the energy mix for the UAE was very much natural gas dependent. So the UAE, being a net oil exporter, has the resources to bring natural gas in to fire its thermal gas plants to power the country. And the installed capacity is about 27 gigawatts, which is on par with consumption patterns for developing countries. So for a country with 10 million residents, in the developing world, we would expect a much lower capacity of something like 6 or 7 gigawatts. But this shows you, again, not only just the forward momentum that is developing through the energy sector, but also the consumption patterns. And this is expected to increase over time. The annual power demand growth through 2030 is increasing at about a 7 to 10% pace, which is pretty much a pace with UAE's projected GDP growth through that period. There's a wide need for power and electricity in the UAE, particularly related to air conditioning. There are some days in the summer that are up to 52 degrees Celsius, and this is something that I've never visited the UAE during that time. I've been told to avoid it during that time. But everyone you meet in Abu Dhabi or Dubai will tell you how hard it is during this time, and it's only going to get worse with climate change impacts. So the air conditioning usage will increase into the future. At the same time, the country needs to create a sustainable water supply. And being an arid country, the only way to do that is to build large desalination plants. So within this kind of future energy mix projection, the leadership of the UAE said, one, can we make a shift to take advantage of the sun's rays and this abundant land within the deserts of the UAE to build out substantive ground mount solar to feed into our energy mix in the future? And the answer was yes, and a program came together to make that happen. So now the UAE government has set a clear clean energy goal for 2050 for 44% renewable energy, and that's not including hydropower. So we're just talking about solar and wind. That's not including nuclear, which is often considered a form of renewable energy. And this is really impressive. It's a global leader, far and beyond what other countries are doing in the north and in the south. So some lessons learned from the UAE. I think that instead of developing this broad 44% target for 2050, that target came through a learning lesson of starting small with both small targets for 3 to 5 year periods of time. And then also, instead of saying we're going to build a 5,000 megawatt solar park, which is happening now, begin with small pilot projects at the 10 megawatt scale, the 13 megawatt scale, to test out, one, the market environment for making this transition, and also to build capacity gradually and develop a snowballing effect that can allow the policy as well as the human resource capacity within the UAE to first gradually develop, but then again reach to a point where there can be a future project that will eventually have 5,000 megawatts of ground mount solar in it. One of these case studies that I'd like to highlight, and we talk about it more deeply in our report, is the Shams 1 concentrated solar project. And I'm not sure if you all know the difference between ground mount solar and concentrated solar. Concentrated solar is the large circular, often circular array of solar panels that catch the sun's rays and then focus it toward a tower in the center, which heats up an element to produce steam. So it's different from ground mount solar insofar as this heat can then be stored into the evening and meet out some of the intermittency problems with solar power. So it's a little bit more expensive, but this project, as well as other projects that the UAE is invested in globally, are showing a new and, I would say, a more efficient way of producing solar power. And after this CSP project began a few years ago, more and more of these CSP projects began showing up all over the world, particularly those invested by UAE stakeholders. Another lesson learned, I think, from the UAE government is that targets are set, but instead of developing policies on how to get there, the government has worked with focus groups from various think tanks, not just in the UAE, but also around the world, to hear out and to tap into the global conversation about solar and renewable energy, and develop kind of guidance on how investors can engage in the UAE, but also to work with investors to see what is hot and what is possible, and to provide a facilitatory landscape for investment in solar as this sector developed. Another interesting lesson learned is the use of a multi-phase scalable project structure to build investor interest. And I think this is really neat, and we're not seeing this in other parts of the global south. Typically, projects in the global south are built out on a project-by-project basis, and one plot of land has one project, and then another one is 50 kilometers away, and they all tie into the grid. What's interesting about the UAE is, and this has to do with the amount of land that is available, as well as the resources that are available within the country to produce this type of multi-phase large plot of land that you can plot out multiple projects in one area, is that the UAE government has provided resources for linking up transmission grid to that project, providing a lot of guidance on how to link into other existing projects as they're built out, and investors can learn from this, and this helps with the efficiency and competitiveness of the project itself. And the multi-phase project approach allows for a kind of specialization over a particular landscape that allows those stakeholders who are focusing on it to stay focused on that particular landscape instead of looking at, say, 40 different separate projects being built out over a country's landscape at once. And it's resulted in this very impressive, one of the largest in the world, solar park. The 4 phases of the Mohammed bin Rashid Al Maktoum solar park in Dubai will reach up to 5,000 megawatts when it is completed. Part and parcel of the multi-phase approach is that instead of posting feed-in tariffs, which is a mechanism to encourage the investment of solar power so that investors are receiving a set amount of income for a particular cents per kilowatt hour, and there's a guarantee within that process, the UAE has adopted a different approach, and that's a reverse auction. So given the engendering landscape that the UAE has created, this reverse auction process allows investors to come in and bid on a particular project with a set capacity, and they can bid down the price. And this one reveals in many ways, what the global price, or the leading global price of solar power is. Not just in the UAE, but again, around the world. And this is something that informs investors worldwide. At the same time, another interesting innovation that demonstrates the flexibility of this reverse auction process is that once a bid is accepted, investors often continue to negotiate and continue to bid. And you can even reach lower prices per kilowatt hour in that process. So the bidding phase doesn't end once an announcement is made. The utilities in the UAE are active in taking on project risk. They're involved in building out of transmission grids, in actual equity of some projects, and this helps to ensure long-term energy security. In Dubai, DEWA, the Dubai Energy and Water Authority, and then in Abu Dhabi Water and Energy Authority, are all very involved in the process for attracting investors to invest in this process. And as I mentioned before, the allocation of land for solar project development and the government's involvement in this, it might be something that's very special for the UAE and unique to the MENA region. In Southeast Asia, we often see countries wanting to deepen renewable energy development. For example, Vietnam, but the land just really isn't available for this type of development. So part of what we promote is an idea of how Vietnam can invest in other landscapes, say in Cambodia next door, where there is a lot of land available. But the UAE, I believe, is unique as having a lot of land available for scale solar development. As Brian noted earlier, the UAE is taking an outstanding role in global energy leadership. The country was the first in the MENA region to adopt the Paris Agreement, and then also bring others from the MENA Agreement and the GCC into the Paris Treaty, all of those countries which are now signatory members. And again, as Brian mentioned as well, the promotion of sustainable development goals that are at the heart of UAE's foreign policy, as well as domestic policy, have done a lot to elevate the region as a whole in its sustainability policy. IRENA, the International Renewable Energy Agency, which I believe our Chairman Emeritus, Lincoln Bloomfield, was part of helping to actually bring IRENA to the UAE, and we're very proud of that process is an international organization focused on promoting renewable energy potential, capacity building, and investment throughout the rest of the world. And it is located in Abu Dhabi, next to the Masdar city. And speaking of Masdar, which is a company owned by UAE's one of the UAE's larger firms, Mubadala, did I get that right? Is actively involved in sponsoring overseas investments. So all of the renewable energy investments that are coming out of the UAE as far as state sponsorship, and there are 11 of them globally, and more expanding over time, are part of the Masdar firm's portfolio. At the same time, the UAE hosts various key conferences, and we were able to go to some of these last year, such as the World Future Energy Summit, and in 2020, the Dubai Expo, which I believe the story of UAE's Solar Power Championship will be central to the Expo's, what the Expo is promoting to the rest of the world. And those that will attend it will see this front and center. So to get into some policy recommendations, how can you take what the UAE has done and turn it into something that's, one, not only paying off for the UAE in terms of foreign policy outcomes, but also for the rest of the world. One is that we believe that the UAE should create a new budget line under the Abu Dhabi Fund for Development strategy, which targets countries with significant energy growth through 2040, particularly those that have coal or hydropower in ecologically risky areas as part of their future energy mix. And Southeast Asia, again, is one of the areas that will be experiencing the most coal growth over the next 2 decades. The UAE should expand government-to-government exchanges with energy officials from the global south, particularly among least developed countries, not only in Southeast Asia, but given the results from the IPCC report that came out about 2 weeks ago, the horizon in front of us is short for making a change and making a shift to renewable energy to reduce our global carbon footprint. And again, most of the carbon emissions through the next 2 decades are predicted to come from the global south. And we can say that development banks, to some extent, the global north are hard at work on promoting this transition globally, but the pot is huge for this. The cake can't be big enough for involvement. So the more actors, the better involved in this process. UAE government agencies and think tanks, and here's an opportunity for non-government agencies in the United Arab Emirates, should publish case studies and policy briefs on UAE policy innovations and what the renewable sector is doing for the country itself. So there are so many stories that we weren't able to tell in this report coming out of the country that are worth telling to the rest of the world. And again, it's not only the robust investment landscape that is productive for UAE, but it's the policy story itself. How do you promote the software, human resource capacity to robustly meet this future energy target? And lastly, the last set of recommendations, UAE's Ministry of Foreign Affairs and International Cooperation should consider explicitly adding SDG 7, which is focused on promoting sustainable energy, as a priority for the next guidelines on strategic engagement. So just as the UAE focuses broadly on meeting its own sustainable development goals, but then promoting these sustainable development goals and how to meet them throughout the MENA region and the rest of the world, take that number 7, make that a champion, and move it forward. The UAE should create short-term capacity building programs for energy planners from other developing countries to attend Khalifa University and Masdar Institute's sustainability programs. Again, there's so much work that can be done on training government officials from, touching on Southeast Asia again, Sub-Saharan Africa, Latin America, and other parts of the world to build this capacity. And from our experience engaging with other government officials outside of the UAE in the areas in which we work, there is a gap. There's just a very large knowledge gap in what the potential of non-hydropower renewables can do to help a country meet its sustainable development goals, but also how fast you can move to develop kind of a virtuous circle, similar to what the UAE has done, with just a concentration of training on capacity building for renewable energy sector development. And I believe I've kind of hit this many times, but Southeast Asia should be a priority target for UAE clean energy diplomacy. Stimson is very happy to be a bridging partner in making that work, as well as with our partnership with the Trends Institute. But this is a region of the world that, unless something happens, will be very much coal dependent going into the next 30 years, when the region should not be coal dependent. So those are my remarks. If you would like to get in touch with me or any of the authors, here's our contact information. I encourage you to reach out to our colleague Courtney Weatherby, who unfortunately couldn't join us today, but she's very much willing to engage with you as well as are we. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Brian. I want to thank Brian F. first. It's always a pleasure to be here at Stimson. Our relationship has been growing and developing over the years, both with Ambassador Bloomfield, who's also a non-resident fellow with us, and with other colleagues here, and I just always enjoy it. We were in Abu Dhabi, Ambassador Bloomfield and Brian Finlay and I and others were in Abu Dhabi a few weeks back for the UAE launch of this report, so we're very pleased to be here today for the US launch. It's one of those issues that, when the idea first came about, we thought, yeah, interesting, looks good, fantastic. Then started digging a bit more, started looking at it a bit closer, and the realization clicked that this is something of profound importance. It's a really big issue. It's something that we do need to just keep moving on. There's both ideas, as Brian said, and practical elements in this, and we just need to keep the sort of innovation, the movement, the momentum, the discussions, the debate going. Now, Brian Heller has given a great overview of the report and a lot of the technical details, which I will admit I am not a specialist in the technical details around energy. So what I would wish to address is just situate this report in the wider issues of energy diplomacy going forth in the world. As you mentioned, for the UAE, this is a priority in foreign affairs, but it's also a priority at home. Yes, it gets extremely hot. Yes, we do need to have the air conditioning on a regular basis. And yes, there is a need for continual water. But it's not just in the UAE, it's around the world. States need significant amounts of energy to continue to grow and develop. But as we also know, we need to find new ways of producing this energy because the world can't quite take the carbon-based energy anymore. And I can talk a bit more about that in a moment. But what always intrigued me about the UAE, and I've been going out to the UAE since the early 2000s in different capacities, it's a state with a lot of carbon resources. I mean, by some estimates, Abu Dhabi alone has enough oil for over 100 years. If you're in that sort of dominant position, why bother innovate? Why bother develop? Why bother compete? You've got enough for yourself, you're good to go. Just keep churning out the oil. But yet the UAE acts like a massive competitor. It acts like, wait a minute, we need to be ahead of the game. We need to be in the forefront of renewable energy, sustainable energy. And they, as Brian was pointing out, they've been investing heavily, they've been making it open for investors, and they've been ensuring the policy supports this. So to see a carbon-based state saying, no way, we're going to diversify. We're going to move away from the carbon sources. We're still going to use them, but we're going to move away from them. We're going to increase the energy mix. We're going to come up with new technologies. It's quite impressive. They don't have to do this if they had a self-centered approach, but luckily the government in the UAE takes a much wider approach, looks at its position in the world and what it can contribute to the world, and therefore it's been very active in this sort of renewable space. I think generally, correct me if I'm wrong, the developing states, the global south, is much more invested into renewable energies than large parts of the West. No real surprise in many respects, but it is something we're seeing global trends on. States that are being impacted by the change in the climate, by the change in energy demands, are the ones that are trying to bring about the most innovation. Now, Brian mentioned the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report that recently came out earlier this month. And I think this puts the timing of our report in a really good position. The IPCC report made it clear that essentially we are screwed. Things are moving much quicker. I mean, there was a great statement, I think it was in the press release, that said every bit of warming, global warming matters. So every little bit is going to have an impact. But that also means every effort to come up with a renewable energy, with a clean energy, also matters. So it might be small steps, but at the same time, it does all matter, and action is absolutely necessary. When they start pointing out that we're going to start seeing the impact of climate change in our lifetimes, that starts to make it a bit more real, because we've been talking about this for years. I mean, I remember growing up as a kid. The oil's all going to run out, and the Earth's just going to explode. And that hasn't quite happened yet, and we see a lot of complacency in our personal lives and our approaches and from governments. But now the situation is getting more and more apparent. But at the same time, the world wants to continue to grow and develop. The world still needs more energy. I mean, we could just tell large sections of the world, stop. Stop growing, stop developing, stop having air conditioning, stop having television, stop having children, just stop everything. But no, how can we do that? The world is growing, the world is developing, and so therefore every response on this is going to count. So we know the actions needed, and I think it's quite important, as Brian mentioned, let's start drawing all the good practices. For the UAE, the Sustainable Development Goals are a key part of its framing and its foreign policy generally, but also within actions internally. The SDGs frame a lot of national policies. There was a lot of discussion and debate. The UAE is active in New York on this, and active in cooperating around the world. SDG 7 on clean and renewable energy is just one part of the picture. When you start looking at the range of the other Sustainable Development Goals, without clean and renewable energy, we're not going to realize things like education, food security, water security. So to look at 7 in isolation would be a big mistake. We need to look at 7 as part of the key to essentially achieving the rest of the goals, because we will need the energy to get there. Now, I think the biggest thing for me when looking at energy diplomacy coming from the UAE is the emphasis on global cooperation. As Brian mentioned, the UAE was extremely active for the MENA region regarding the Paris Agreement, brought in other countries, has continued to remain active in that space, brought IRENA into the country as an example to show it's willing to work with multilateral organizations, and essentially just try to make sure that its knowledge, its information, its understandings become part of the global approach. Now, in looking at energy diplomacy, I think we're also looking at, I wouldn't say a paradigm shift, but a shift in focus in how we understand energy and global affairs, global diplomacy. When I was at university, it was all about competition over scarcity of resources. You're fighting for the coal, you're fighting for the timber, you're fighting for the oil. You want more than the other guy has. If you have more, you can do more, you're more powerful, you're stronger. Hey. Those days are fading away. There's less about competition when we start talking about renewables, when we start talking about sustainable energy sources. The sun shines around the world, therefore you can't compete over it. I think there's been a few Disney films out where somebody tries to steal the moon or steal the sun, but I don't think that's coming in the near future. So everybody can benefit from this. So when we're looking at renewable energies, the opportunities in the diplomacy field are much larger than the risks. So the South-South cooperation is extremely important. I mean, it is interesting talking to folks from around the world and how the sort of North-South relationship continues to inform how we understand things. I think what the UAE and others are showing is that, well, we don't need the North. Innovative ideas, advancements in technology can come from the global South. And that is, again, a shift in the paradigms and how we understand development in many respects. And moving the energy diplomacy forward, however, we do need to get the message out there. And by getting the message out there, I mean, yes, we understand climate change is a problem. We understand we do need more renewable energies. We do need more sustainable energies. But let's move from that discussion to practical measures, as Brian was outlining. There's a whole range of good practices out there. Let's get those into the discussion. And having conversations with ARENA, that's one of their biggest tasks, but as they explained to us, is also one of their biggest obstacles. A lot of the representatives to the organization are engineers. They want to talk about the tech, they want to talk about the science, but ARENA, starting from, I think, early next year, is going to start putting the renewable energies into a security framework, into a policy framework, to get more holistic action going beyond the tech, to get a better understanding of how this impacts on the politics and the day-to-day lives of individuals. We certainly need more multilateral approaches. And again, this is where we can see some good practice come out of the UAE. UAE, through Masdar, invested with the Pacific Islands Forum to provide sustainable energy issues for that part of the world. And this year, they've set up an agreement with the Caribbean states to cooperate at that multilateral level, to provide the various things Brian was talking about in the recommendations: information, knowledge, training, understanding, support, investment. All of this leads to helping to build essentially a better global structure, a better global architecture in this space. And that's where the diplomacy side of energy is going to become very important, is trying to build this global architecture. If we can get more cooperation, we can get better discussions, and then hopefully we can start seeing a better quality to the solutions that are out there. Now, I was struck over the weekend when I arrived. I was reading a book review in the Washington Post, I think it was. Somebody's produced a very large study of energy, a history of science type thing. And in the review, the guy's talking about how mankind, humankind, has always been able to overcome the energy problem. Faced with obstacles, faced with crises, new technology, new innovation comes in it. But the reviewer sort of concludes going, well, kind of the problems today are almost a bit beyond us. Can we resolve it? You know, can we overcome it? Do we have the ability to stop the climate change problem as we're seeing? I don't know what the answer to that is, but I think through this report, we've been able to identify there's a great deal of potential and possibility out there, provided we keep this discussion going through both formal government avenues, through non-governmental avenues, including business, but also, and this is another area where I find the UAE is providing another good example, we need to make sure that we have an intergenerational approach to this. In the UAE, the government has set up what they call youth councils. There's a federal youth council made up of individuals under the age of 33 who directly advise on policy developments for the government. They are active. They're not sort of just window dressing. They're not sitting at the end in the corner someplace. They're actively involved. The UAE Ministry of Climate Change and Environment and Climate Change, or Climate Change and Environment, one way, has a youth council as well, an active one. In Abu Dhabi last week, Trends did an event on youth and sustainable peace where all of our participants, all our speakers, were under the age of 33. And it was an outstanding event because it demonstrated the power of the youth voice. But also, going back to the IPCC report, the youth of today are the ones that have to live with all the mistakes and all the problems of the hundreds of years before them. They have the vested interest, so we need to get their voices to the table. So this is another one of the good stories coming out of the UAE, is looking at the ministry setups, looking at the various study and focus groups, the different voices that are getting into it to actually bring about substantive change and real change in how we approach some of these issues. So I have to say, it was a great pleasure working on this report with Stimson, with Brian and Courtney in particular. I learned a lot. It was a great pleasure to work with such knowledgeable people, but also such professional people as well. This came together fairly easily, I'd have to say, compared to some other publications I've done. And I'm certainly hoping that this is the starting point of continuing these discussions on where we need to move energy diplomacy for a sustainable future, that allows everybody to have a stake in it. So once again, thanks to Brian, thanks to Courtney, thanks to Stimson for making this possible, and I would then like to hand the floor to Ambassador Bloomfield.
Thank you very much, Richard. Good morning, everyone. To start with, let me say I'm sorry that Courtney Weatherby couldn't be here to speak for her excellent role in bringing forward this piece of work between Stimson and Trends. So I take no credit for it, which gives me the license to give sort of a bit of an observation from up close. Let me just say, first of all, that I'm really happy to see the relationship between the Stimson Center and Trends Research and Advisory in Abu Dhabi. As has been mentioned, I have a role here at Stimson, having stepped down from the board. I'm the chairman emeritus, but also involved in programs, including a sustainable energy program that we hope to bring forward soon. And as a non-resident senior fellow at Trends, it gives me the opportunity to go to UAE, which I've done many times over the years, and to really get a feel for a very different environment for these same subjects. And I will talk about that just a little bit. When I have not been serving in government, I've had some private sector experience and have gravitated toward renewable energy, sustainable energy, and I would simply say that my involvement is at very small scale, off-grid, trying to power villages in places that have no chance of getting grid power. And so I can't speak about the large global trends that you've been hearing about, but I do believe there is a paradigm shift that's maybe a century in the making from the peak of the industrial age, where electricity is dangerous stuff, so only engineers who work with governments can deal with it. And we created a monopoly system where all the power was generated in a very large central location, whether it's a coal plant or a nuclear plant, and then you had distributed power, and everyone needed to get attached to the wire in order to have power. That is changing. That's changing extremely fast, even in the United States, where the policy is not pushing sustainability from the top. There is still a very rapid change taking place. And frankly, the utilities are sort of in the middle of that conversation. What we've seen in the UAE is that the leadership from a very early point has taken on sustainability as a fundamental objective, and the results are quite evident. They're even more evident when you sit in Abu Dhabi, as we did just a month ago. There was a very impressive audience, as there is today. The audience in Abu Dhabi all represented government agencies, non-governmental UAE entities that are 100% devoted to sustainability, renewable energy, and international organizations like UNHCR, Mercy Corps, and others. They all came to the table. There's a rich community of expertise in the UAE around renewable energy, and this started a long time ago, and that may explain why. Global energy consumption is expected to rise almost 30% through 2040 if nothing changes. And I do think there is, as I say, the ability of small-scale individuals and entities to to create energy locally, both just to have energy, but secondly, to create resiliency. Because when the grid goes down, no one has power. Even solar fields, which are grid-tied, even when they work, they don't work at night. So battery storage, power management, these things are coming to places all over the earth. And I think we're going to see a lot more local and resilient and redundant energy using solar in particular, but also other forms. So what we found in Abu Dhabi is that they realized that renewable energy is the fastest growing type. Solar installations are dominating the new energy, but frankly, they're actually spending more worldwide on solar energy than on fossil fuel energy. And so people talk about promoting coal and whatnot, but there really isn't financial, the private equity markets are not going to invest in something they're not certain will be acceptable. I think nuclear industry has struggled, and without prejudice to other industries, renewables have quite a bit of private capital pushing them in the United States and around the world. There's a need for more investment and technical assistance in developing countries, as Brian Eiler has explained so well. And this, I think, is driven by a recognition, including among youth, here and there, and all over the world, that the worst impacts of climate change can only be averted if action is taken on every level. And the UAE has really been a leader in sustainable development, and it didn't come late to this party. I mean, I recall I was working with some investment people. We were very close to the UAE. I had a long involvement with the UAE as a government official and knew them. And I remember when Masdar was just a plot of land, and we were sitting in a trailer talking to their founder, who's now the head of ADNOC, His Excellency Sultan Al Jaber, and there was a vision there. And he came to New York, and he briefed at the UN, and came to Washington, and went all over the world talking about the vision that the UAE leaders had for a world where energy could be created locally and sustainably. And they really meant it. They mentioned IRENA. I can't take credit for the location of IRENA, but I did write a letter privately to 125 missions at the UN, simply to make a case, with all due respect to the other bidder, which was Germany, that Germany would be an excellent location for an international organization. Of course it would. But not once had the international community sort of taken the step of putting an international organization outside of North America or Europe. They'd never done it before. And I said, the UAE is ready. I have no idea if it had any impact, but the fact is that the UAE was ready, and they've proved that they're ready. And IRENA has been there now for a decade. And now there's a community of expertise that's global, that's local, and there's work to be done. I mean, there's a lot to be done, even in the UAE, but they're committed to it. There's an MIT collaboration. There's annual conferences. There are prizes they've given out. They are open to the best science. Now you have something called the Year of Zayed, sustainability. This is a national commitment. And I think what the message I want to impart here in Washington as we roll out this excellent report is to sort of tell the Middle East crowd, and I go to a lot of policy events where we talk about the Middle East policy. They never talk about this. And you'll never understand the UAE until you understand how hard they are running on sustainable technology and renewable energy. It's really telling that they have a vision of the future, and they're standing behind it, and they're pushing it. And there's a lot of organized movement that is moving the needle in the UAE. What we're seeing now is that what the UAE has done, we think it will resonate with other countries in the global south. People will look at this and say, if they can do it, maybe we can do something too. The example is powerful. There are lessons learned. The UAE has adopted many innovations to make it more affordable, more economically competitive with traditional fossil fuels. The work that Brian Eiler and Courtney have done in the Mekong is an area where 60 million people in several countries are at risk. Fishermen seeing the biodiversity disappear because people are damming different parts of the river, and there's a lot of upstream damming as well, which is affecting the ecosystem and ultimately puts at risk the entire economy of the region. So Stimson for years has been studying this problem, and Brian Eiler and Courtney Weatherby have had the thought that what the UAE is doing could be very useful and instructive and could help the Southeast Asian countries and communities actually organize in innovative ways that Brian has just laid out for you. This is emblematic of Stimson's transnational approach of innovation with impact. And I have to say, I really salute Trends and Stimson for uniting on this one. As I say, I had nothing to do with it. I'm just sitting here kind of as a cheerleader. But this represents the best of what both entities are all about. And it's a really significant story with real impact. So I want to commend this collaboration. I think it captures the best of what think tanks can do, not just to talk about things, but to point the way to real impacts that improve the security, written broadly, not military security, not economic security, but really the ability of societies to prosper and to live 20, 30, 40 years from now. Both these think tanks have combined on something which I think sends an important message. So I'm hoping that today's discussion will stimulate people in Washington to take a close look, read this report. It's filled with surprising information, even to Middle East policy hands. They will be surprised to see just how much they've done. And try not to be jaded. I'm talking to my friends now, my policy friends. UAE has done an awful lot, and they have tremendous knowledge and expertise and tools. That's why, by the way, Stimson and Trends are talking about taking some new steps with the UAE. And these are people who've taken a lot of steps with the U.S. government, quite frankly, over the past decade. The same people have said, okay, the U.S. government moves at a certain pace. Let's see how fast the UAE can move. And we're very, I think, optimistic that the UAE is a place that can make decisions, mobilize resources, pull inside and outside expertise together without any sort of jealousy. They really want to move the needle on this because they understand that this is fundamental to the well-being of their own country and to the global South and to the world. So a really compelling, important, and very innovative effort here. My hat's off particularly to Brian and Courtney. Thank you.
So that concludes the panel portion of our presentation and report launch today. We're going to move to a discussion where we'd like to hear from you, some thoughts, some reactions, and discussion of opportunities, because we're really looking to the future. I think within all the messages, we're thinking out 1, 2, 3 decades, even farther into the future, with mention of youth leadership and youth empowerment, with a mention of a huge capacity gap that needs to be filled in the global South. That would be policy capacity, policy implementation capacity, sectoral capacity, and then an investment that's related to that. And then the UAE's role within this, and the UAE's partnerships with other countries that can help take this movement forward. So I'd like to invite you for comments, questions, clarification. Mike is in the back. He's going to run the microphone. And if you have a question, please raise your hand and briefly identify yourself before asking that question or providing the comment. Thanks.
Hi, my name is Matt Schubert. I'm curious to hear about one of your policy recommendations. Oh, I'm sorry.
Could you start over for the live stream?
Oh, sure. Hi, my name is Matt Schubert, and I'm interested on the policy recommendations. You say you talk about working with research centers and think tanks. I'm curious about, in particular, what specific projects or areas those initiatives should pursue, and what kinds of outcomes in terms of actionable steps you would expect to see from that.
Right. But like I said, there are gaps that need to be filled. And there's a lot of promotion that can be done of pilot projects, as well as the policy experiences coming out of the UAE. A lot of the UAE's current energy diplomacy focus has been on island nations, because island nations, one, are climate threatened with coastal sea level rise, but also mostly face high power prices, high electricity tariffs, where solar can immediately come in and make a difference. And I think there's a competition aspect there that makes it an advantage for the UAE to engage with those countries. Also, it spreads the goodwill of the UAE across many different countries around the world. I believe there should be a transition, a focus to more continental approaches. As the UAE is a continental country, not an island. And with that, the gap really needs to be filled in terms of power sector planning, which the UAE has a lot of capacity on and experience, and then facilitating a healthy landscape for broad investment at the scale of what we're seeing in the UAE on some of these continental countries where coal is still 6 cents a kilowatt hour, 5 cents a kilowatt hour. Natural gas, which could be a form of clean energy, is also at a lower price. But these are where the beasts are crashing down on a landscape where it's hard to drive the solar conversation forward. But for countries that are starting from scratch, like UAE did for the most part with this power sector planning, with this transition, countries like Cambodia that have 40% rural electrification and are able to build out that type of hybrid centralized as well as decentralized system at the same time. There are many countries like that around the world where the UAE can engage in filling those gaps. So within all those countries, there are think tanks, universities, and it's just a wide playing field, I think, for the UAE as well as other global actors to be engaged in.
And just more generally, I mean, getting more of the think tanks, more of the research centers involved, it just helps to amplify the results. It helps to amplify the good stories. So it just helps get the information out there. I mean, I think one of the surprising parts is that folks with the technical knowledge will know of some of these things specifically. But beyond that, there seems to be a lack of awareness, both within countries where some of these developments are happening and in the wider scope of things. So what we need the think tanks and the research centers to do is just to tell these stories, quite simply. I know that sounds very simplistic, but there's a lot of interesting stories out there. Then hopefully these stories just continue a conversation. They start providing some evidence-based research that others can then take to either their government, take to another international organization, take to their investors and say, hey, let's go look at this again. Let's go look at this some more. I mean, when we had our initial discussions about this, I learned quite a bit what was going on in Southeast Asia. They just didn't know anything about it. And so that's where, I mean, governments are busy. They have a bunch of things they have to do. They have their own business to take care of. But in an area like this where we're looking at impacts upon society, roles of business, roles of government, roles of individuals, there's a lot of stories, a lot of information out there, and I think that's where we need to make sure we just get multiple voices continually talking about this in the hope that things start scaling up somehow.
Jackie?
Hello, my name is Jackie Kemper. I'm with the Stimson Center. So I wanted to go back and make a quick comment on a couple of things Brian mentioned and then with a follow-up question. So one thing, Brian, that you mentioned that I think has come up as a theme in Southeast Asia for both you and Courtney in your work, but also elsewhere, is this idea of needing to kind of approach this issue on a regional scale,
Sure.
Especially when you were talking about the issue of available land. And looking at, potentially looking at Cambodia as an alternative place to really try to work together for where you are strategically looking to develop these new energy sources. And when we start talking about regional scale, it actually really sounds like the Youth Council idea that UAE has. If we could expand that as part of the government-to-government interactions that you talked about in your recommendations, I feel like really developing that larger conversation, Richard, that you're speaking to, the place for that to really be nurtured and developed now is in the younger generation, right? And I think that just from my travels and engagement in the nuclear sector, you really see more of a natural desire and excitement to walk across the room and talk to people from other countries, whether that's at the IEA or in some of these other youth forums. And so I'm just curious if there's been any discussions about how to really push that idea of something similar to a youth council, not only to push it and have that be in some of these other global south countries, but also in then how do we start to create a network among those youth councils towards some of the goals you've all spoken to.
On a personal level, I'd say it'd be an ideal situation. I certainly hope it can happen. I mean, you're absolutely right. When we did this event last week, we did a youth forum on the UN Youth Strategy on, I think it was principle number 5 on resilience and security building. And we had 9 individuals, 2 from the UAE, the rest of them from around the world, from the US to Scotland and throughout Central Asia and Africa. And it was a great situation where once they introduced themselves, they were gone. They were just talking, they're this and that, and they're planning. Within 20 minutes, they had their own WhatsApp group all set up, ready to go. And I'm still sitting there, who's who. It was just amazing. And so I think that's a really good idea. And it's one thing I'll take back with me is, because it's interesting, this is sort of off topic for a moment, but it shows where the UAE's innovation, but also daring, if I could use that word, in policy is on display. They appointed a minister of youth who is still only 24. People did, I don't want to say laughed at this, but people questioned this. Well, how can this person be a minister? Or there were question marks over her role in the cabinet. And for everything we're hearing, she has a voice at the table. Okay, she's not just sitting back saying, "Oh, I'm the young person." And then if you start looking at some of the other ministries, I think the Minister for Advanced Sciences is again falls within some of the youth categories. She's only in her early 30s. So you see this sort of dynamic group. And what the UAE's done in some of the scientific spaces is at the initial stages of research and development, they have created a youth-based group saying, you figure it out. And then come and we'll have a discussion in the wider scope of things. So trying to get these networks of youth councils, I think is an outstanding idea, and we'll do everything in our power to sort of support it. And I'll sort of take it back and get the government to sort of start talking about it in these ways, particularly where they've already done work, say in the Pacific Islands Forum, because I know the Pacific Islands Forum does have forms of youth engagement as well. If they're working in the Caribbean, if they're working with CARICOM, that could be another possibility. But yeah, I think it's an outstanding idea.
So, two-finger follow-up here.
Hello, I'm Susan Bass with the Earth Day Network. We've had the pleasure of working with the UAE on the Zayed Future Energy Prize and several other initiatives. My question goes to, also related to youth. Has the UAE looked at integrating energy and related topics such as climate into their formal education curriculum, especially for middle and high school students? We found, and actually this is also part of the SDG that is on education, we really need to, if we want to have the next generation really focused on these issues, we really need to be starting younger so that we have created a pipeline of innovators and thinkers and engineers and the people we need to really fast forward this green economy. So my question is there anything in this report or anything that's happening in UAE on the formal education side that could help promote this new generation of educated green activists?
I think you've both identified the next report subject.
Absolutely.
On moving this to the younger generation and into and learning. I don't have an answer to the education curriculum question. Perhaps either of you do.
I don't know of anything. I know the SDGs are being brought into the curriculum as just an overarching element. But I think also it's one of those areas and spaces where there is a lot of the non-formal education going on. So via various what they call youth circles, they also have a youth hub in Dubai. It's happening in the volunteering spaces where they provide opportunities. The Emirates Foundation is working in this space as well. So in the non-formal education element, there is a lot of this going on. Within the formal curriculum, I'll have to check and get back to you on that one.
And then just to make a broader comment on the youth capacity promise as well as the regional issue. Yeah, I agree. The UAE has planted a stake in the ground, a flag in the ground on within the MENA region that we're going to be the sustainable energy champion. We're the leader, not just in this region, but globally, and has a lot to say for that. There are many other regions in the world where that story can be told. Our work in Southeast Asia has, for a long time, been trying to push both, I will clarify, mainland Southeast Asia and the Mekong region, to push both Thailand and Vietnam to do more in these. And then perhaps you could have two kind of poles in the region to compete with each other, and then you develop a virtuous circle, and a lot of good can come from that. But it's a tough road to go, and especially in countries where there's so many other development challenges that do not have, say, the per capita incomes and the resources available to those in the UAE. Also, from a regional approach, it's who takes the charge, who takes the lead. Is there a regional institution out there that, say, a leader like the UAE could plug into, like the GCC, which it has and is leading, or is is that regional institution one that lacks a lot of momentum for forward progress? You know, there's a lot of criticism towards ASEAN as an institution that helps to enforce regional integrity, but not necessarily move the needle forward on some of these critical issues. So within Southeast Asia, perhaps there's another regional framework that can be applied, like Thailand's new ACMEX initiative, or the U.S.'s Lower Mekong initiative. But there needs to be a kind of a catalytic element that brings the leadership up and then forms the grouping that can tie a region together within renewable energy promises. One final point on Southeast Asia and youth initiatives, and this is where you've given, both of you have given me a great idea to approach the State Department and say, the State Department has worked for the last 10 years on this YSEALI program, the Young Southeast Asian Leadership Initiative, which, by the way you're all describing the regional meetings of youth, sounds exactly what it's like when these Southeast Asian youth get together. But energy and renewable energy is not kind of at the forefront of this, and climate change to some extent is, but can always be pushed farther out there. So I've been inspired by your comments to take that message as a new way to move the needle forward in Southeast Asia, also globally. Are there other regions that can have a similar YSEALI, and can that YSEALI experience be transferred from, say, the State Department as a new initiative to other geographies is something that is worth pushing for as well. Question?
Hi, I'm Cassie. I'm a program associate at the Osgood Center for International Studies. You talked about multilateral approaches and partnerships, and you kind of briefly mentioned the UN. So I was wondering what the UAE is doing to promote their work at agencies in the UN, just more detail about that, and how they can appeal to the developed countries to have them put more focus on global energy. Also, how is this? I want you to go into more detail about how the private sector is being appealed to these initiatives, just because I think that's an important step.
Maybe I can throw a little bit of light on that. The UAE ambassador or permanent rep at the UN, Her Excellency Lana Nusseibeh, is very interested, as is the Ministry of Foreign Affairs that backs her up, in promoting SDG 7, the sustainability goal. The Stimson Center and Trends are in discussion about ways to be more comprehensive in looking at how the United Nations itself uses energy around the world and UN agencies. And so I think that the answer to that question may evolve impressively in the time ahead. We're hopeful that it will, but there's no question that they lean very far forward. I spoke with, and so has Brian Finley and others are familiar with their views. They are basically being told by their leaders, this is what matters, make something happen. So they're leaning far forward, and it takes time to change. I wanted to address a comment about industry and government and youth and what it takes to make the change, because I've watched the agencies of the U.S. government address things. When President Obama went to Tanzania and created Power Africa, for example, we had 2 brown bag lunches at the Energy Department to say, all right, what are we going to do? What are you going to do? How can we make this happen? And my only comment, and there's an energy bureau that was created at the State Department, and it's a policy bureau. They don't actually fund or change anything in terms of on the ground. So the question is, how do you make that change? And I've already mentioned utilities and others who are the stakeholders of the status quo and are very uncomfortable with the notion because they're legally required to provide energy to everyone in the room. And so when you start to defect from the grid and say, oh, I have a solution, I'm good, but if I need you, I'll turn you on, that doesn't work on a grand scale. That it undermines the sort of economics of the status quo. It's not easy. I would say this. What I see in the UAE is the capacity not only to talk about it, not only to lay out a vision all the governments of Europe, the United States do that, not only to put something on a podium and say, give a prize, which they do, not only to set up institutions which are leaning forward on sustainable renewable energy, but they actually, to make it happen, what you need to do is build something that's different from what people are doing today. You have to build it, and then you have to measure it. And of course, ARENA is there. They do a lot of data measurement. The potential is there in the UAE to listen to what the youth solution might be and say, instead of patting someone on the head and giving them a prize and you have a photo in the magazine as the high school student of the year, build it and then test it. And then the data's out there, and then you can really promulgate the fact that energy is so expensive in the developing world. I mean, if you go through Africa, the cost per kilowatt is much higher than it is here in Washington, D.C. And the poorest people of the world are paying the most for energy. That is a huge opportunity. It hasn't happened yet, but it will change when people say, I actually have a solution, I've built the solution, we've tested it, here's the data on the status quo, here's the data on what's available, and now you have the industry organized and you need the finance. And the EU had a €100 million private equity pool for energy in Africa. They were waiting for people to say, yes, I can do these projects at schools all over Africa or markets or small manufacture or villages, and we will get revenue from that. This is doable, but it takes some groundwork, and this is why I applaud what Brian and Courtney did in Southeast Asia, because they have opened the way to a vision of a plan, something we can do, get busy, not only at the prime minister's level, which they are involved in this, but now down to the village, the locality, the farmer, the fisherman. Once they start to do this, a lot of amazing things will happen. There'll be a lot of data collection. There'll be people who say, well, I can build that too, or maybe we should have a factory here to do these PV cells, or these inverters, or these power management, or these battery storage. All of these technologies are moving. Technology transfer is doable. It's just, those are all the pieces. And I'm a little bit, I sit here before you as someone who would like to have seen more happen in the United States at the federal level, and would like to encourage them to lean forward more. But frankly, the private sector, working with all willing players, has to do something too. And the pieces are there. They just have to be connected. And so it's a case of talk about it, but do it. And this is why Stimson and Trends are not just talking about it, but they're actually doing it.
I think to follow up on the pieces are there, they just need to be put together. The report tells the story of how those pieces came together in the UAE, which is, again, quite impressive. The magnetism, the clustering effect that has developed the pathway for reaching that 44% renewable energy mix in the future. But to highlight some specific examples on what the leadership of the UAE did to attract investors, and this comes from our meeting with investors. And when you're in Abu Dhabi or Dubai, you're not just talking to Emiratis, you're talking to a lot of expats and others that are very excited about this opportunity, that have moved to the UAE to invest and to embark on a career in this opportunity. The various Emirates, Dubai, Abu Dhabi, and others, compete with each other to some extent on this process. And that helps produce kind of a healthy landscape that can drive this discourse forward and the sectors forward. Dubai is a little bit more market and innovation leaning, which we might expect from Dubai. And Abu Dhabi is a little bit more government-led as the seat of government. And both have produced different outcomes that have allowed both Emirates to move forward. But I think one of the big differences comparing the UAE to other developing countries who struggle with the transition to the renewable energy as a robust part of its power sector is the participation of utilities. And I touched upon it earlier in my presentation. But for example, in Dubai, DEWA, when you go to these conferences, DEWA's got one of the coolest, brightest presentation booths there. And the officials and staff of DEWA are there front and center to talk about how investors can work with them to more deeply invest in that locality. But also, like this, the Mohammed bin Rashid Al Maktoum solar park in Dubai that will reach 5,000 megawatts in the future. To date, those projects are all required to have a joint venture with Taiwan. And you might want to throw shade at joint ventures in terms of competitiveness and the concerns within, but it's very interesting to see a utility wanting to take on equity of a project. And that helps de-risk investments for investors, which is the biggest concern, the level of risk for a particular investment. So the signaling of sharing that risk and the actual follow-through is something that utilities in other parts of the world are just not doing. Utilities in Vietnam and Thailand are very stodgy, traditional, old, all the things you expect from institutions that have been around for 50, 60 years and have been very much reliant on fossil fuel consumption for power generation. But the utilities in the UAE are very forward-thinking. So utility to utility exchange, I think, is one that could be very useful for the UAE to consider linking up with other utilities worldwide. And then lastly, like the Abu Dhabi Development Fund, and there are other funds out there that provide investors and stakeholders interested in getting their feet wet first in the UAE with some of the pre-feasibility funds as well as grants that can help take these projects across the finish line. And this is what development finance institutions do. This is what the World Bank does. This is what the Asian Development Bank does. But here's another actor, right, or a set of actors, institutions in the UAE that can help contribute to that process. So expanding that to more of a foreign policy approach, I think will pay off in the end for the UAE and other countries that are considering shifting towards a deeper renewable energy mix.
And just go back to the first part of your question, what is the UAE doing at the UN? I mean, I think that's one of those areas where, yeah, there's a story to be told there. So we need more of a study for a think tank to sort of get out there and look at it. But what I do know is if you look at their primary statements from the mission, and this, I think, is a good thing. It doesn't really matter what the topic is. The issue of sustainable development always comes into it. They'll be talking about conflict, or they'll be talking about some other issue, and they say, well, we need to make sure that our solutions follow a sustainable path. Plus, the UAE is very active in the sustainable development goals, not just for itself, but in providing mentoring and support to other states as well. So I think there is a lot of activity going on. For a small mission, it is doing a lot of work, but I think that's one of those areas we need to sort of get the story out there and see what's going on. When we were doing some research for this project, I came across, I think it was a study from the American Chamber of Commerce done about 3 or 4 years ago that outlined in detail all the stuff the UAE had been doing. And I think that's what we need to do with Trends, is put something like that together as well. That's what's happening.
Any final comments or questions? Nadir.
Hi, thank you for taking my question. I'm Dr. Nader Gohari from Global Risk Intelligence. I just had a question with regards to exporting renewable energy and whether you had any forecasts for exporting that within the GCC, for example, with Oman or Saudi Arabia or Qatar. Thank you.
We haven't looked into it within the context of this project. I know it's something that is discussed. I know Saudi Arabia is involved in this as well. And Japan has put some investments into some large projects there. And there are also grand visions. China has visions for building projects in the MENA region that sends power to China. Those are probably way out there, particularly in this age where we're working on, is the future decentralized or centralized? Is the future about long-distance transmission, or is the future about rooftop solar and other forms of energy generation coming from all around us, and power generation? We haven't really figured out how this is going to play out, I believe. But a lot of the literature really leans towards decentralized future. That would be, again, step 3 of this process.
Yeah, I think there's great potential. You have to look at supply and demand. So there are some countries in the MENA region, in the Gulf, that are oil exporting countries. that have more than enough for their own population. Saudi Arabia has a larger and growing population, and they may have 100 years of oil or more, but they want to monetize that to support their future and not use it up in secondary petroleum-based industries where they end up consuming it and they can't sell it. So I have felt for some time now, as I've watched some successes and failures in the United States, and have already mentioned a few factors in that actually the larger and more natural market for solar power is the Gulf. It's not the United States of America, it's the Gulf. And that I predict that they will go on a grand scale because the solar conditions are so obviously amenable to that form of energy, but also because some countries in the region have to pay for oil and are very dependent on others. There's energy shortages, if you will. I'd say not shortages, but there have been energy demand and supply imbalances in the Northern Emirates, as we've seen. Dubai built itself very fast, and they had to look for other things. That's why the civil nuclear program made some sense for them, but it's also why renewable energy makes enormous sense for the UAE. Oman has natural gas, but again, growing economy. And if you move a little bit outside the Gulf, Jordan and others, there is a need for homegrown power, and there's an opportunity. So I come back to whoever shows that it works, whoever actually builds it, and they can build it with their own technology and transfer technology from the West as need be. And this is why Masdar is playing an important role in the UAE. Once they show that it works and the economics are clear and it's analyzed and it's disseminated, I think that the momentum will be great. There's also an enormous role for humanitarian and developmental energy, whether it's in the markets of Yemen, whether it's in Gaza and places like that. There's a huge pull there's a shortage of energy, and there's a restricted possibility for development if they're just going to rely on, if you will, buying diesel off the grid or grant-based donated energy and small-scale generators. I predict that will change, but that may be the last thing to go, because you start with addressable markets that have finance behind them, and then as you scale this energy, it becomes much cheaper. And you can build, the unit cost goes way down. And that's when it really starts to take off at the household level all over the Middle East. So I predict they will move very fast. The only question is, can the West keep up with them?
Okay. Thank you all for your comments. If you haven't already, please grab a paper copy of these. We have some out there. It's also available online on the Trends website as well as the Stimson website. This event, I should have said earlier, was on the record and recorded and live streamed, and will also be posted for reference on the Stimson website and on the Trends website. So look forward to more work like this coming out of the Stimson Center and Trends through a collaboration. We are now excited to kind of take a deeper dive into, again, producing, implementing working to implement some of the recommendations that we've made in this report. Thank you all for coming.